I am so stoked to be talking to you about Code Connect today. You don't even know. I've been thinking about this problem for a very long time. I've been building plugins trying to desperately solve this problem. And the fact that we have something now in our product to start doing design systems code gen makes me so happy. For those that don't know, my name's Jake, as described on this slide. I'm a developer advocate here at Figma, part of our advocacy team. And I'm going to get to demo Code Connect. I think before we dive in, it's going to be really good for us to kind of get aligned a little bit on exactly what problems this solves. So, like we were talking about earlier, complete design systems still can struggle with adoption in code. So you might have a component library inside of Figma. You might have a component library in your code base, and they use as much of the same language as they can. They share a bunch of different patterns, right? But there can still be friction when you're trying to have that be adopted through feature development and having those components implemented in your code base. And I think there's three key reasons that we like to focus on here, because I think these are the ones that are closest to Figma. There's three key reasons why this is hard. The first one, like we were talking about earlier, is that the style code that we surface inside of Figma is really helpful when you're building a component, but it is not what you need when you implement a component. And any software engineer that's familiar with this problem understands this, right? So the style code, the analogy that I like to use is like if a component is a tool in like a workbox or a tool belt, there's code that describes how to build the tool, right? Like how to build the hammer, how to build the screwdriver. But the code that developers need when they go to use the tool, right? When they're using the component is different code, right? I need to know what tool I'm grabbing from the tool belt, right? I need to know how to go about using this to solve my problem. And that code looks a lot different. So this is the code that we see design systems engineers can kind of use this code to build out the component library. It's really helpful. But then once that component exists, we're looking for something else, right? So that's the first thing, is that natively inside of Figma, we're rendering kind of that style code, not component code. The next reason it's hard to drive adoption of a design system is that context switching to documentation can be really hard. So for those that don't know, like engineers open up their code editor, and when they're implementing like a component, the developers that build those components typically put documentation in the code and all of these things to make it very easy so that things are being suggested, and developers get very used to having kind of like this really nice kind of flow as they're coding. That's this perfect blend of documentation and code writing. And it's not always perfect, but a lot of the times it's really, really a great experience, and you're learning as you go. Now, when they have to switch over to a design tool like Figma to begin to look at things, they need a lot of help, right? And so that's why we've created dev mode to kind of like surface the appropriate information for what you're consuming as a developer inside of Figma. But now if I have to go learn in another place how to use the component that I'm supposed to be implementing, that can be yet another context switch that really takes me out of my flow. Now, documentation is an incredibly valuable thing. And a lot of folks set aside time to learn how to use a library, and documentation is great for that. But what we found is like a lot of our customers are in the middle of building out their design system while it's being used by their teams, right? And so you kind of have to like learn as you go. And oftentimes during feature development, developers can't set aside time to fully learn things all the time, right? They have to kind of like learn as they go. And one thing that can happen is if all of that information is elsewhere, now if I have to leave to go learn all this stuff, I'm going to be taken out of my flow. And oftentimes I just don't think it's worth it. And I'm just going to go off the dome, think of the best guess that I can, right? And then go try and implement that, right? So this is another reason why adoption is hard, is because sometimes the time isn't always there to learn. And it's especially hard when those learning resources are external to the design tool or the coding tool. The last reason I want to touch on, I know there's some engineers out there being like, this isn't a problem if you do this right. Well, guess what? It still can be, because at scale especially, it can be hard to find the right component to use. And there's a bunch of different reasons for this. The first, easiest reason that this can happen is legacy code. Everybody's favorite type of code is legacy code. It's the code that exists, the old version of the design system that we still have to support for that one flow because we can't refactor the entire flow yet. And so it still relies on the old UI. If you can't tell, I've been in that situation before, and it's really annoying, and you can't touch any of that stuff, right? And so you have buttons that are 5 years old that are not the ones you're supposed to be using, and you don't know which one you're supposed to be using for this specific feature, for example. Also, what can happen is at scale, you have other sections of your application or maybe multiple applications, and they all have components that are named the same way. And sometimes it's for a very good reason. Sometimes it's because this part of the product looks a little bit different and functions a little bit differently. So there are these vanity components that are only really meant to be used over here, but they're still named the same thing, right? And so finding the right component isn't always as easy as we would like it to be. So that's the third reason. Now, enter the solution, design systems code in Figma. So Code Connect brings component code directly into dev mode, right? And that helps your developers use your design system. So when they click on the button, they see a snippet that looks like this. In this case, we're talking about React, right? And for those that don't know, like this button component is something that our engineering team made, right? This is kind of like unique to our engineering team's component library, right? And so the way that you use that tool has very specific instructions, right? It's kind of like the IKEA instructions to precisely assemble this thing. There's no margin of error, right? You want to use it the way that it was designed, and it was designed by your teammates, and your teammates have that knowledge, right? And that knowledge kind of sits in your code base. So we want the exact component code to implement what we're seeing in Figma to be surfaced in Figma to make our lives easier as engineers. So how does this work? We saw this slide a little bit earlier, but I think it's important to kind of go over this again. Someone who has the knowledge of how the component library and code works authors a Code Connect doc. And that Code Connect doc is a piece of code that sits in your code base. It references components in your code base, so it has all the validation and all of that sort of thing. So that sits in your code base. Someone who, sometimes at some of these companies, it's just that one front-end developer who can span design to development patterns, right? Sometimes it's an entire design systems team has engineers on it to help solve this problem. But someone who has that understanding of how to turn Figma patterns into code patterns authors this doc, right, in your code base. Then it gets published in one swift little fell swoop over to Figma and linked to a component in Figma. We're going to do this in literally 30 seconds. And then from then on, anytime someone selects a instance of that component that's been linked to code, they're going to see the relevant code snippet, right, inside of Figma. And then we're done. Like, that's it. We're done. All right, let's get into it. This has been far too much talking. Let's take a peek at our example file here. So this is kind of the UI library we've been using. We're going to switch to another one in a second. But we have a button component here, right? And, sometimes your button components are pretty simple. Sometimes they're really complicated and have a ton of patterns. This is kind of somewhere in between, right? So we have a bunch of different variants. I think the best way to actually understand what's going on here is to open the component playground in dev mode, right? So this is kind of giving us this interface, so getting to play around with the different variants. We can toggle some of these Boolean properties here. We've got this full width one. I'm going to turn off disable so we can see all the pretty colors. And then we also have the ability to show an icon, swap that icon out for another instance. And we also have this text property called label, where we could just say framework or whatever, and kind of get to see how the Figma version of this component is kind of structured and the patterns that are kind of underneath it. So that component exists in Figma. And what we're used to as engineers, as we come over and we consume your designs to go build out the features, is instances, right? So we kind of have component set with all the variants kind of being our definition in a sense. And then we have instances down here. Now, we can see that these instances are rendering or, doing some code over here in the sidebar. And we can see that the CSS is surfacing style code, right? So that's the code for how to build this component, not how to use it, right? And so as a design systems engineer, I look at this and I'm like, that's helpful. When I go build this component, this is the sort of information I need. Oh, cool. If you're using variables, those turn into CSS custom properties and token names. And because we're doing things the right way, that lines up with the tokens that we have defined in our code base. And we have the ability to kind of like reference either static values or the dynamic values here to go build this thing out. But once this is built, it's built. We don't need this style code anymore, right? We've encapsulated it in our code base, in a component, in a pattern. And now we just need to know what's the name of the component and how do we use it, right? And so that is the sort of code that we want to see here at this point in kind of these stages of feature development. So let's do that right now. I've been talking way too long. Okay, so we're going to select the main component, right? And then what we're going to do is we're going to do Command L, which is Jake's favorite way to do it. But then we can also right click, control click, whatever it is for you, and click copy link to selection. And for those that don't know, what this link is it's a link to this file and a link to this node specifically in this file. So now that that's on our clipboard, everyone buckle up. We're going to the code. So this is my code base. It looks scary. It's not, I promise. This is the button definition in our UI simple library, right? So this right here is some TypeScript React stuff that I wrote as an engineer to kind of represent the patterns functionally of this button that we're going to be documenting, right? And so we see CSS classes, whatever. Now, we don't need to look at this at all. I'm just showing you that it's here because we're in the code base and we're going to be referring to this component, right? Okay, so I'm going to move my face out of the way because I'm tired of looking at that and I need to get over here. So what we're going to do is currently we're in the command line and we are at the root of this project. I'm actually going to change my directory to source UI simple button, and I'm going to move there. For those that don't know, we're running command line commands that are navigating the file system. So we're in the button folder, right? Which is just right over here. Think of this as Finder for all of you non-coders. So now what I'm going to do from here is I'm going to do Figma Connect. So I've installed Figma Connect in this code repository. And then I'm going to hit create and I'm going to paste that link, which I thankfully did not overwrite on my clipboard. Okay, so we're going to do Figma Connect create, and then that's that link to that node in Figma. And when I hit enter here, everything's going to work perfectly because this is a live demo. Perfect. So we see that this new file got added. Let's take a peek at this. So this is a Code Connect doc that is kind of being scaffolded for us by Figma. And I'm going to remove all of this stuff, letting us know what's going on so that I could tell you what's going on. I'm going to hit save. And what we can see is that it's importing our button component. So this is everything that Figma can like interpret from the component that we just linked to, right? So it guessed you probably have a component with the same name as the component in Figma. So it's importing that component, right? Which is that file we were looking at, the scary one earlier. And then it's importing Figma from the library. This is something that developers are very familiar with. We've installed Figma Code Connect in this code base. So it's importing Figma. And then this is it. Figma Connect, and then we refer to that button in code. We refer to that URL. You could write these from scratch if you wanted, but the create helper over here is super helpful. So this is that URL that we pasted to the node. And then this little object right here is how we map and refer to Figma properties, right? So remember we were looking at the icon, the label, the show icon, Boolean, the variant. This is all just kind of an initial mapping of those values. We ran this one command and we haven't done anything. I've just been talking this whole time. From this place, all we have to do is write Figma Connect publish. And what that's going to do is it's going to publish everything it can find in this directory over to Figma. So we ran the create, and then we're just running the publish. And now when we select this instance, because everything is working perfectly because this is a live demo, we've made like a very basic Code Connect doc documenting this component with stuff from our design system. And you might be like, well, that seems silly. It's not changing. That's because we haven't done the code part, right? So let's do some of the code part. I'm going to come back here. And instead of this self-closing button instance, we're actually going to close it the proper way. And I'm just going to insert props.label, right? So this is the name of that text property on the Figma component. So when I hit save and we publish again, we are going to see now go, right? That's the value of that text property. Hello world is the value of this text property. No icon here is the value of this text property, right? So we can just go through all of these here really quick. We'll just do icon equals props.icon. We also have disabled, which is nice. I want to props.disabled. And then we also have the ability to refer to the variant. I'm just going to type that in here. Oh my goodness. We'll get variant equals props.variant. This is important because I want to show you one last thing once I get all these in here. Some more hype in the chat for live coding. Can we just get like live coding is awesome in the chat? Also, I need to hydrate. I saw someone was referring to always be hydrating, which I was really happy to see. And then we also have a full width Boolean property, props.full width. I think that's everything. And what we can see here is that we're still this red underline for the coders in the room. They know what this is, but this is basically telling us this isn't fully valid code yet. And the reason for that is because there are other things that aren't in Figma that are in code. And this is really important. This is a very important concept. We have properties that don't exist in Figma that do exist in code. For example, on-click, right? So I'm going to put this on-click handler here. This is where I would functionally describe what to do with the button when you click on it. Okay, so now we have a valid code snippet. I'm going to come back here. We're going to publish again. We're going to switch over. And we have a fully documented button that quickly, right? So if I click on this one, we're going to see this. Now, the icon arrow doesn't have a Code Connect doc on it yet, but it will in just a second. But it does show us that we're actually linking to the icon arrow. When I click on this, it jumps us over to that specific component. We do also have this disabled, smaller default size variant instead of the large variant. So this is it. We have changing code snippets based on which instance we have selected, and that's informed by the code base. We can see right down here, here's exactly what component's referring to. Also, we have React right here, but if you had iOS, like with Swift UI, you had Storybook, those sorts of things, those would be available to us here. You can have multiple documentations for the same component in Figma if you want. Now, always be hydrating. We're going to hydrate. Nah. Sweet. So let's talk about a slightly more sophisticated component here, right? So I'm going to actually come back to the code base and I'm going to cd ... and we're going to need cd ... one more time. All right, now we're in the root of our directory and I'm going to run Figma connect publish. I'm behind my face. I hope that was the right code. Yeah, I am. Okay, great. So we published for every piece of documentation inside of here is now published to Figma. So if I switch out of our simple UI and I actually go into not simple UI, I have a doc right here for this button component. Now, this button component's interesting because we have a state variant. So if we actually open this up in Playground, the state variant, which I've prefixed with an asterisk to let people know, hey, this is actually a little bit different of a variant. We have active, default, disabled, focus, and hover as kind of states. And for those that write code, they know that like states are typically just handled in CSS. Those aren't technically properties in terms of like on a React component. And so there is one caveat to that though, which is that when the state is disabled, commonly disabled is actually a property too. So we can see that like hover isn't accounted for here. Focus isn't accounted for here because that's just handled in style. That's not a property. But if we select one of these disabled ones, we get disabled, right? So let's look at how we did that. I'm going to come back over here and we're going to look at this line right here. So what this allows me to do, enum is our way of referring to a variant, right? So state is a variant. And all we're doing is we're saying the only variant option we care about is what's named disabled in Figma. And we're going to say that the value is true for a property we're calling disabled. And you can ignore all the rest of them, right? So this is an example of like a developer convention that doesn't really exist in Figma. Like we need to do more sophisticated kind of code generation, and we wouldn't necessarily expect the Figma pattern to be identical. Like the Figma pattern still needs to account for all these different states, and that's great. But we only really care about it as a prop when it's disabled, right? So there's a lot of things like that in design systems, and the API around Code Connect gives us the ability to do that. So here's an example of that component. Now, let's get a little bit more complicated. So here's an example that a lot of you might be familiar with, where we have, instead of using a variant called variant to denote like the color differences, you might have a scenario where you have separate components in Figma that are all one component in code, right? So this is that example. So we are many components in Figma, but if we look at the Code Connect snippet, get out of the way, Jake. If you look at the Connect snippet that's being rendered over here, we can see that this is just button with variant primary. And then this secondary button component is just button with variant secondary. And the same is true for inverse, right? So let's take a peek at how we solve this problem, right? So this is the problem of 3 distinct components in Figma going to 1 component in code. So I'm going to switch over to the second example here. I'm going to close that out. So I put that props definition in a variable, and this means we can reuse it multiple times. And if we come down here, we see we actually have 3 Code Connect docs down below. And essentially what we're doing is we are saying the variant is primary explicitly for a unique URL in Figma, right? So this is to the primary button component in Figma. The secondary button component, we could see that these node IDs are a little bit different. That's because they're referring to those 3 different components in Figma. This one is the secondary one. So we're just explicitly saying variant is secondary. And then down here, we're saying variance inverse. So we just do 3 Code Connect docs for the 3 different components and then render exactly what we want to see for each of those. And they can all use the same button component in code, right? So that's how we get that result. Now, you might have said, well, that's cool, but what about the opposite? Well, I've got the opposite covered too. So here's an example where you have, and if you're kind of in like the Swift UI universe, this is going to resonate, right? We have 1 component in code that maps to many component, or 1 component in Figma that maps to many components in code. So let's look at this one, right? So this is all coming from 1 component set named button, but when we select the variant that is primary, we're loading up primary button. And when we select the variant that's secondary, we're loading up the secondary button. And when we're doing inverse, we got inverse. Let's take a peek at how we do that with Code Connect. I'm going to come over here to this third example. So again, we're storing all the props in 1 object up top so that we can reuse it. And then the URLs now are all the same, right? It's 27969 because that's basically this 1 component in Figma over here, right? So the URLs in Figma are the same, but the components we're referring to are different, right? So I'm loading my primary button up at the top here. We also have a secondary button right here. But the distinction that you might have noticed is that we added another thing to our Code Connect doc that filters based on the variant. So we're basically saying, do this Code Connect snippet, but only for the variant primary on this button, right? And then when the variant is secondary, we're filtering just to this variant, do this one. So we have the ability with the Code Connect API to essentially target specific variants of 1 component with different outputs. Now, in this case, they're all very similar. They're all different components, but very similar props. But oftentimes, you have very different combinations of props based on the component. And so this gives you the ability to do that and handle that. Now, for my last example, my last trick, I'm actually going to hydrate. This is my second to last trick. It wasn't that special. All right, last trick, dialogue. So here's an example of a component that has child components, right? So we have an actions component here, and spoiler, we're rendering the button Code Connect docs inside of it, right? So we could see those buttons, right? It's reading the button ones for these button children. We also have a content component, right? That has, in this case, what we sometimes call slot properties for the text properties, right? So this component has a content and a headline string property, but we're turning it into a slot property inside of here. But let's start with kind of like the composed version of this, right? So on actions, right, we have a Code Connect doc. Let's go look at it. So over here, I'm going to open up my dialog directory and we're going to look at the actions component, right? Here's the actions component, and right next to it is our code connector. So we've put in the URL to actions in Figma. And we can see that we have this new prop that we're naming children. This could be framework if we wanted, right? But it's called children. And what it's using is the children mapping from the Figma API. And so what this allows us to do is allows us to pass in an array, or a list, if you want to think of it that way, of names of children that we care about. And if we come back over here, we can see that these are both named button as children of actions. So we could just say button, and it's going to refer to both of them. We'll see in a little bit how you can pass in multiple names, but we're not going to worry about that right now. So we're basically saying props.children is the value of any child of this component in Figma that's named button. So here we're rendering dialog actions from our code, and then we're going and finding any children. Now, if those children also happen to have docs, which we just saw earlier, right, the buttons, it'll inject them right here. So that is how we're bringing in these two children. Now, let's look at instances of the dialog. So the dialog has this cool little property up here called actions, and it's a Boolean. When it's true, we show the actions instance, and when it's false, we hide the actions instance. So let's take a peek at how we're doing this. Now, we're working on multiple levels of children coming in. That should be something that we're supporting very soon. But right now, we can see that we're pulling in on this instance, an instance of content and an instance of actions, right? And in the future, buttons would be inside of it. So let's look at how this is being done. And then when we select the one without actions, actions is not visible, right? Even though it's here, it's just hidden. Let's look at how we do that. So I'm going to go to the dialog, and we're going to look at the Code Connect doc right here. So again, linking to dialog, and then we have another children prop. But instead of this being linked directly to Figma.children, we're actually linking it to Figma.boolean actions. And we're saying when that Boolean property is true, find the children, content, and actions. When the Boolean for actions is false, only find the children, content. And so that's what allows us to conditionally render the actions code down here when we using a single Code Connect doc on the dialog. Okay, let's talk about just how special this can be before we get out of here. So I'm going to copy this, and as we come back to our code base, we don't need to save you. I don't even know what that was. I actually have an app running here, and if I grab the simple browser in VS Code, which is a really cool tool, we could see that we're actually rendering code from our code base, right? So I just copied dialog. So by the way, this is how simple it is to center in CSS these days, and it's really nice. I'm going to paste this, and I'm going to hit save. And what we'll see, oh my goodness, why aren't you working? Refresh. Did something stop working? Oh, it failed to load a URL. Oh my goodness. Hold on, we're doing it live. Let's try this again. Please render. Was this not working? Let me actually come back and live demos. We've got this though. Check this out. I bet if we take this and we put this in, it's going to actually work. Save. It's just going to work. It's not working. It's missing an icon. Dang it. So this is valid code, I guess is all I'm trying to say. And we were going to render it right here. I don't want to open up my web browser because I think something else is wrong right now. But that's on my side. But essentially, what this allows us to do is put the actual valid code right inside of our app, and this would render, I swear, if this was working. Okay. Back to the presentation. Just a couple more slides. So again, like Emil said earlier today, pricing is available. It's available with org and enterprise plans today inside of dev mode. Currently supports React, regardless of whether or not you're using Storybook. There's some cool Storybook plugin stuff that you can do. And then we have Swift UI support as well. Future support, Android Compose. I already saw Vue.js in the chat. I saw AngularJS in the chat. Those are absolutely the sort of things and the feedback that we're looking for. Thank you. I also saw a reference to web components, which I'm really stoked about, and I fully agree. That should be on the radar. We're also just working on the underlying, allowing it to be easier, since this is going to be open source, to kind of build your own adapter for it. Just some quick little tips here to get started. Prioritize impactful components. So the most used components in your design system, the best ones to start with, like a button, for example. Also the most complex ones, the ones that you're going to save the most amount of time by kind of having generated in a doc inside of dev mode for your developers, are also great places to start. Collaborate when translation gets complicated, because it will, because patterns in design and code can be very similar, but also very different at the same time. But I also wanted to flag, Code Connect doesn't require commits to your code base to start to see the effects of. Like, we didn't commit any of that code that I just wrote in order to see that impact, right? So you can get started without having to worry about like, are we going to have to like fully commit to this or whatever. You can start to kind of like see that and create those links today to start to see what that looks like. So check out the repo, give us feedback, github.com/figma/code-connect. And coming up in just a second, we're going to have a roundtable discussion on design to code, led by Anna. We're going to have Raul, Lucas, Gilson. So stoked. Thank you all for sticking this through. It was great hanging with you. Love y'all. We'll talk soon.